It was a quiet evening, and I had just come back from a long day out. The house felt empty, and I assumed my father was still at work. I threw my bag on the bed and headed to the closet, eager to slip into something more comfortable. I chose my favorite lingerie set, soft, lacy, and black. It made me feel powerful and confident, even when no one else could see it. I started changing, letting my clothes fall slowly to the floor, enjoying the way the silky fabric felt against my skin. Just as I was adjusting the straps of my bra, I heard the door behind me creak open. My heart skipped a beat. "Dad?" I froze, turning halfway, still holding on to the fabric that was barely covering me. He stood there, eyes wide, clearly surprised. But there was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just shock, it was something else. "I'm sorry," he stammered, but instead of leaving right away, he lingered, his eyes darting away and then back at me. "I didn't know you were. I was just coming to ask if you needed help with dinner." I didn't know what to say. My body was half covered, my heart racing. I expected him to leave, to close the door, but he didn't. A strange tension filled the room, one that made my skin tingle with both fear and something unnameable. "Dad, it's okay. I'll be down in a minute," I said softly, feeling my cheeks flush as I tried to cover myself up, but I didn't move fast enough. His eyes met mine again, and for a moment neither of us moved. He finally nodded and turned away, but not before I saw a flicker of something dark, something hidden in his expression. He left the room, closing the door behind him, and I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His lingering gaze, the way he hesitated. Did I imagine it? Or was there something more? My mind raced with thoughts I shouldn't be having. The next day, I tried to act normal. I came down for breakfast, acting like nothing had happened, but my father was different. He was quieter, watching me in a way that made my skin tingle. Then came the moment I didn't expect. Later that week, we were home alone again. I was in the living room, reading a book, when he walked in and sat next to me, closer than usual. His hand brushed against my arm, and my heart sped up again, just like it had when he'd walked in on me. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable the other night," he said, his voice lower than usual. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "It's okay," I managed to whisper, though my body was tense. He reached over, his hand grazing my thigh, and everything inside me screamed that this was wrong. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I felt a strange excitement building inside me. I knew I should have stopped him, but I couldn't. His hand rested lightly on my thigh, and the air between us thickened. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath shallow. Everything felt surreal, like I was caught in a moment that could change everything. His touch was barely there, but it lingered, testing boundaries neither of us had dared to acknowledge before. "We should probably stop," I whispered, my voice shaky. But even as I said the words, I couldn't make myself move. My body felt glued to the spot, suspended between what I knew was right and the undeniable pull of something forbidden. "I know," he murmured, his eyes fixed on mine, searching for any sign that I might tell him to leave. But I didn't. I couldn't. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of us sitting there, caught in this delicate balance between desire and restraint. His hand moved just slightly, fingers brushing over my knee, sending a shiver up my spine. Then, as if realizing how dangerous the situation had become, he pulled his hand back abruptly. The spell was broken. He stood up quickly, running a hand through his hair and stepping away from me, his face pale. I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't right. I shouldn't have." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but the guilt was clear in his eyes. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving me sitting there, breathless and confused. I stayed frozen for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. My skin still tingled where he had touched me, and my mind was racing. What had I just allowed, and why hadn't I stopped him? The next few days passed in a blur of awkward silences and stolen glances. My father avoided being alone with me, and I did my best to pretend that nothing had changed, even though everything felt different. The tension between us was undeniable, but we both knew we couldn't acknowledge it. One afternoon, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The house felt stifling, and I needed some air. As I walked through the park near our home, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, the look in his eyes when he'd hesitated at my door. My mind was consumed with questions I couldn't answer, and the guilt that gnawed at me was almost unbearable. But even as I tried to push the thoughts away, I couldn't deny the pull I felt. Something had changed between us, and no matter how wrong it was, part of me couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The line we had crossed, though faint, was still there, looming, waiting to be stepped over again. That evening, things came to a head. I was in my room, trying to focus on some reading, when there was another knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat, knowing who it was before I even heard his voice. "Can I come in?" my father asked quietly from the other side of the door. I hesitated, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I should have told him no, I should have made up an excuse. But instead I said, "Yeah, come in." He opened the door slowly, stepping inside with an unreadable expression on his face. He didn't sit down this time. Instead, he stood in the doorway, his hands nervously fidgeting by his sides. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was wrong, but I don't know how to stop." My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, every word sinking deep into me. I knew I should have stopped him, should have told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I looked up at him, feeling the same pull I had felt before, the same magnetic tension between us. "I can't stop either," I admitted quietly, my voice trembling. It was the truth, no matter how much I hated to admit it. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. We just stood there, the silence between us heavy with all the things we couldn't say out loud. Finally, he took a step closer, his expression conflicted but intense. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice rough, "but I don't know how to make this go away." "I don't either," I whispered back, my throat tight. Another beat of silence passed, and then, as if by some unspoken agreement, he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. I stared at the closed door for what felt like hours, my mind swirling with everything that had just happened. We were both walking a dangerous line, and we knew it. But somehow, we couldn't seem to stop ourselves from coming back to the edge, again and again. The days that followed were filled with even more tension, as if we were constantly tiptoeing around a secret that neither of us could fully face. It wasn't long before my mother noticed. She hadn't said anything outright, but her glances grew sharper, her questions more pointed. "Is everything okay between you and your dad?" she asked one morning, her tone casual, but her eyes filled with suspicion. I forced a smile, trying to act as normal as possible. "Yeah, everything's fine. Why?" She watched me closely, as if searching for something in my expression, but after a moment, she dropped it and moved on to another topic. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head, and they did. One evening, when my mother was away for a work trip, my father and I were left alone in the house. The tension between us was almost unbearable. Every glance, every accidental touch, charged with unspoken desires and the weight of everything we had done and hadn't done. That's when it happened. He came to my room, just like before, only this time he didn't knock. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside, closing it behind him with a soft click. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, his eyes serious. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, we do." He sat down next to me on the bed, closer than usual, but this time there was no hesitation, just a shared understanding of the line we had already crossed. He sat down beside me, and the silence that stretched between us was heavy, almost suffocating. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, but I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on me. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with all the possible ways this conversation could go. "I don't know what to do anymore," my father finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was looking down at his hands, avoiding my gaze, but his presence so close to me was enough to send my thoughts spiraling. "I can't stop thinking about it. About you." A shiver ran down my spine. Hearing him say it out loud made everything feel more real, too real. I should have felt disgusted or at least scared, but instead all I felt was that same strange pull, that tension that seemed to have taken hold of both of us and refused to let go. "I've been trying to forget it," I admitted, my voice just as quiet. "But I can't either." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer, as if hoping I would say something to make all of this easier, to somehow make it go away. But I couldn't. The truth was, we were both trapped in this moment, in this strange, forbidden connection that neither of us could explain. "I never wanted this," he murmured, shaking his head. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how things got like this." I could hear the guilt in his voice, but it didn't change the fact that we were both sitting here, unable to tear ourselves away from the edge of something dangerous. "We could pretend it never happened," I suggested weakly, though even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't be enough. The tension was too strong, too deep. We could just go back to normal. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Do you really think we can do that? After everything?" I didn't answer. Deep down, I knew he was right. There was no going back, no undoing what had already been done. We had crossed a line, and pretending wouldn't change that. For a moment, I thought he might leave again, walk out of the room like he had the last time and try to put distance between us. But instead, he stayed, his body tense beside mine, as if he was wrestling with the same thoughts I was, torn between what he knew was right and the impossible pull of what we had become. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "We can't." His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and I felt that familiar jolt of electricity run through me. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. My heart was pounding, and every logical thought in my head was drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. "I know," he said, his voice rough, filled with the same conflict that was tearing me apart, "but I don't know how to stop." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Neither of us moved. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as we sat there, caught in the web of our own desires and fears. And just when I thought the tension couldn't get any worse, we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My mother was home. We both froze. The sudden noise shattered the moment like glass breaking, and reality came crashing back down around us. My father stood up quickly, running a hand through his hair, his expression panicked. "Get yourself together," he whispered, glancing back at me with a mix of guilt and urgency. "We can't. Not now." I nodded, my heart still racing as I tried to steady my breathing. He left the room without another word, and I heard him rushing down the stairs to greet my mother. I sat there for a long moment, my body still humming with the tension of what had almost happened. The following days were filled with even more unease. My mother hadn't noticed anything unusual that night, or at least she hadn't said anything. But I could feel the walls closing in. Every time we were all in the same room together, the weight of our secret hung in the air like a storm cloud. I couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous, but the pull between us only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Every glance, every accidental touch sent my mind spinning, and I could tell he felt it too. Then, one evening, everything changed again. My mother had gone to bed early, leaving my father and me alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt too loud, too charged with everything unsaid. I was sitting on the couch trying to focus on the TV, but I could feel his presence beside me, heavy and tense. Finally, he broke the silence. "We can't keep pretending," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and something deeper. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." I looked over at him, my heart pounding again. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I can't stop thinking about it either." He turned to face me, his eyes dark with the same conflict I felt. Whatever this is, it's tearing me apart," he said, his voice low. "But I can't stay away from you." His words hit me like a punch, and I felt the air leave my lungs. The tension between us was so thick it was almost suffocating. I wanted to say something, to make it all stop, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was stare at him, feeling that same dangerous pull drawing us closer. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "But I don't know how to make this go away." "I don't either," I whispered back, my throat tight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, the silence stretching between us, filled with all the things we couldn't say. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, my mind swirling with everything that had just happened. The days passed in a blur, the tension between my father and me growing unbearable. We barely spoke, avoiding each other in every possible way. But the moments when our eyes met across the room, the brief touches when passing each other, they told a different story, one we were both too afraid to confront. Then came the night everything changed. It was late, the house silent, and I was in my room again, trying to sleep. But I couldn't. My thoughts were too loud, too tangled. I kept replaying everything that had happened between us, wondering how we had gotten here, how things had spiraled so out of control. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside my door. My heart leapt into my throat. The sound was soft, careful, but I knew it was him. The doorknob turned slowly, and I held my breath. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable. We stared at each other in the dim light, the unspoken tension crackling between us like electricity. He didn't say anything at first, he just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the first move. "I can't do this anymore," he finally whispered, his voice low and rough. "This secret is destroying me." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. "Then why are you here?" His eyes darkened, and for a moment I saw something in them I hadn't noticed before. Something desperate, something dangerous. "I'm here because I don't know how to let you go," he said, stepping closer. "And I don't think I want to." Before I could respond, the door swung open again, but this time it wasn't just him. It was my mother. The shock on her face was undeniable. My blood ran cold as I realized what she had just walked in on. She looked between us, her expression twisting from confusion to understanding, then to pure, burning rage. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fury. My father stood frozen, his face pale, unable to say anything. I was paralyzed too, my mind racing, trying to come up with some kind of explanation, but nothing came. There was no way to explain what was happening. She stepped toward him, her eyes wild. "How long has this been going on?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "Tell me the truth." Still, he said nothing. He couldn't even meet her eyes. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about just us. It had never been just about us. My mother had suspected for weeks, maybe longer, and now she had caught us right in the middle of the disaster we had created. I had thought we were careful, but we weren't. We never had been. Without warning, my mother reached into her pocket and pulled something out, her phone. She had been recording everything. I knew something was wrong, she spat, glaring at both of us. "I've seen the way you look at each other. I thought I was crazy at first, but now I have proof." She held up the phone, her hand trembling. I felt the room spin. I didn't even realize I had been holding my breath until it escaped in a gasp. "You both disgust me," she said, her voice filled with venom. "You'll never get away with this." My father finally broke his silence, his voice hoarse with desperation. "Please, don't do this. We can talk." But she cut him off, her voice rising. "Talk? You think I'm going to talk to you after what I just saw? You're a monster. And you," she turned to me, her eyes filled with betrayal. "I thought you were my daughter, but you're just as sick as he is." Everything was unraveling. My father was begging now, his voice desperate, but my mother wasn't listening. She stormed out of the room, phone in hand, and I could hear her dialing someone, probably the police. The next hours passed in a blur. My mother didn't come back. I sat in my room, paralyzed by what had just happened. My father had disappeared, and I didn't know what to do. The sound of sirens in the distance jolted me back to reality. They were coming. I should have felt relieved that it was all over, but I didn't. Instead, I felt hollow, as if everything I had known had collapsed in on itself. The secret that had been suffocating us for so long had finally come to light, and now there was no escape. The door burst open and the police stormed in, their voices loud and commanding. They took my father away, his face blank, his eyes dead. I watched from the stairs as they led him out in handcuffs, my mother standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. It was over. But in a way, it had only just begun. And now, here I am telling you my story. I need to ask you, did I do the right thing? Should I have stopped it sooner? Should I have told someone? Or was it already too late from the moment we crossed that line? I don't know anymore. All I know is that everything has changed, and there's no going back. So tell me, do you think I handled it the right way?